coming at you live from the woodjerseys.com studios. It is season 7, episode 1 of the DFO podcast, presented to you by our friends at oddshark.com and DoorDash. It has been an absolutely exciting offseason to date, but sometimes it's the moves that you make early in the offseason that really pay dividends. And I think one of the biggest offseason acquisitions had to be DailyFaceoff.com acquiring Frank Seravalli. Frank, it is so great to have you on the show. It is so great to have you be a part of the DFO team. We've got Brock Seguin and Beebs Bondy here with you, Frank. Welcome to the team and welcome to the DFO podcast.
Brock, Beebs, great to be with you guys. It's you guys have put down such a great foundation at DFO, and I'm excited to join in and get this party started.
Yeah, you coming aboard really kind of legitimizes everything that we've kind of been putting together and all the hard work we've been putting in over the last 8 years. So I'm sure your phone the day you announced that you were coming to DFO was crazy, but I like to think that my phone was almost similar to yours. People were like, dude, you got Frank Seravalli? Like, how did you do that? And I'm like, I really have no idea how we pulled this off, but it is an absolute honor.
Yeah, I mean, the things that everyone has in the works at Daily Faceoff to build this out, like I said, and the foundation that you guys have put together, it's an exciting time. So we're going to be really busy here over the next few weeks. Everyone's been saying, hey, like, have you gotten a break, or are you going to get a break in August, get some time off? I'm like, no way. I got a bunch of people to hire and add to the team so we can really build something special. And, by, this time, 2 months from now, the start of October, after training camps have opened, we're going to have some really exciting things underway, some new shows, some new platforms, definitely some new people in the fold, some other names in the hockey media space that you will have recognized and known. So hopefully your phone can continue to blow up here.
There you go. You heard it here first on the DFO podcast. Even more exciting things coming to dailyfaceoff.com this offseason. Frank, you absolutely stole the show at the expansion draft. Twitter was ablaze because of what you did. Some people agreeing with the fact that you basically broke every single pick. Some people not. We don't care so much about those people. It was tremendous work.
Just awesome to watch. Yeah.
But it's like I said, it's been an absolutely electric offseason thus far. So we want to just talk to you really quickly here and just kind of go through the list of teams that really improved their teams and some teams that maybe didn't do enough with the cap space or the assets they had at their disposals. We'll start on a high note here. Who were some of your big winners in the offseason to date?
Okay, so before we play winners and losers, I want to just throw a little caveat out there. I don't play the loser game. I'll just say teams that maybe didn't meet expectations or could have done a little bit more on that front. So I'll run through my winners pretty quickly, and maybe some of them will catch you by surprise. So here's one, the Winnipeg Jets. I love what they did on their defense. It's so tough for Winnipeg to attract some free agents that a lot of times they have to make their moves through the trade market. And I think they did it on two fronts with Brendan Dillon and also Nate Schmidt. Excuse me, I was almost going to call him Nick Schultz. That's another name from the hockey past. Nate Schmidt. Those two guys. Brendan Dillon is such an underrated acquisition. Every team that I've talked to that he's played on, guys absolutely love playing with him. They fight to be his D partner because he makes life so easy for you on the blue line, and so. Those two guys, I think, have upgraded their back end really significantly. You've already got Connor Hellebuck in net. You've got one of the premier top 6 forward groups in the league. You've definitely got some depth. And so the fact that you're adding those two guys in, I think, catapults the Winnipeg Jets into Stanley Cup contender category. Another winner is a team that was really good last year. They just ran into the Tampa Bay Lightning in the first round, and that would be the Florida Panthers. I think that team has another level to get to. They need to have the same sort of Sam Bennett that they had in the last few weeks of the regular season and the playoffs. You add in Sam Reinhart, a guy that you could probably pencil in for 30-30 easy. Like, he was already doing it in Buffalo on a tough team. I think you add Sam Reinhart to the mix once you get him signed. That's going to pay some big dividends. And then you've got Spencer Knight, a full season of Spencer Knight. In tandem with Bobrovsky. I really like what the Panthers are building. I've got 3 other winners for you. The Chicago Blackhawks, now that they know that Marc-Andre Fleury will be showing up, they got him for literally nothing. Tyler Johnson they got for next to nothing. And Seth Jones upgrades their blue line. I think that team, in a year where the Central is in a little bit of transition, You've got the St. Louis Blues, maybe a team that's on the way down. They need to find a way to replace some significant goals when you lose likely Vladimir Tarasenko, Jaden Schwartz, Tyler Bozak, Mike Hoffman. That's a lot of goals to take out of your lineup. I see a team like Chicago really sort of vaulting up in what's been a disappointing and really confusing offseason off ice for the Blackhawks. We have to address and point out the sexual allegations, and it's been really difficult to digest that part of it off the ice, but I like what they're doing on the ice. The Arizona Coyotes, who would have penciled them in to be a winner?
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. 7 draft picks now in the first 2 rounds of the 2022 draft, which is supposed to be a really, really deep draft. Yeah, one of the best. So if you add in 7 picks, they're in the race for Shane Wright as it is, and it's going to be them and Buffalo, the race to the bottom. I really like Arizona's chances, given the roster that they've put together. And when you have 7 picks, that sort of lends itself to the Coyotes being back and being competitive sooner rather than later. And the last one on my winner's side is the New Jersey Devils, Dougie Hamilton, Ryan Graves on the back end, and then Jonathan Bernier to play in tandem with Mackenzie Blackwood. I think that Devils team is probably a little bit underrated in terms of the season that Hughes had up front, the continued growth from Nico Hischier. I think that team could be pretty competitive in the Metro this year.
Yeah, it's funny that you say the Arizona Coyotes because they really did have an impressive offseason, but it's also just going to be hilarious how impressively bad they are. I mean, is their number one goalie really going to be Carter Hutton? Maybe Josef Kornash? Like, they are impressively bad, but they are stockpiled for the future without question.
But that's the point, is like, if you're going to be bad, you might as well not be like
you want middle. Shane Wright next year. He's the number one consensus. You want to just lose and have the best odds.
They're, like I said, they're going to be in competition with Buffalo to do that. So, try and beat as bad as you can. And if you're going to be bad, have 7 picks, 7 cracks at it in those first 2 rounds. And perhaps you get lucky. Perhaps you get in a situation sort of like the Ottawa Senators were in. They traded Erik Karlsson to San Jose. They got a first-round pick. They would have never thought in a million years that pick would be in the lottery. And, of course, they ended up with 2 picks in the top 4. So, I think the Sens are going to be really competitive. I think Arizona has the chance to follow that same sort of model in 2 to 3 years' time.
You mentioned the Chicago Blackhawks, bringing in Seth Jones. Would you maybe consider the Blue Jackets as winners this offseason as well? They ended up getting a pretty nice return for Seth Jones, a guy that made it very clear that he wasn't coming back. Bringing in Boquist is obviously a nice addition. And they did a couple of other nice things as well. They actually got Patrick Laine to sign a qualifying offer. Adam Boquist, as I mentioned, Sean Corrali. Would you just Jake Bean as well? Would you consider them to be winners at all, or just kind of whatever?
I don't think they're winners or losers or disappointing, just because I think the reason is they're kind of in that exact middle ground that we were just talking about. And unfortunately in the NHL, it's like no man's land. It's the one place you don't really want to be, probably well outside the playoff picture, but not bad enough to be in the real lottery conversation. And so that's sort of the tough middle ground that they're wading through at the moment, is like that team. And I really like the hire that they made with Brad Larson as their coach to replace John Tortorella. I think he has some real potential, and I think some players on that team do. It seems like they maybe overpaid a little bit for Zach Werenski. It's just a lot of pieces to tear off from that core when you consider all the names that have moved on in the last short while here. Seth Jones, Nick Foligno, Cam Atkinson. Like, these are all pretty big pieces that you're taking out of the lineup that are just difficult to replace, and is going to put that team in a tough spot for a couple of years.
Before we get to some of our disappointing teams or my losers, can you provide some clarity as to what is going on in Dallas, having now brought in Braden Holtby, seemingly now having 4 NHL goaltenders on the roster? Obviously, Ben Bishop's a little bit banged up. I mean, thank God for websites like DailyFaceoff.com that will tell you who's going to start in net, because I have no idea.
Shameless plug.
I have no
Fantasy
idea.
Owners are going to hate are going to hate Dallas this year because it's just going to be consistent daily face-off checks. I mean, they'll love our site, but at the same time, it's really going to piss them off.
What's wrong with that? I mean,
we have no issues with it.
It's good for business.
Dallas should sign one more goalie actually while they're at it. Really spark things up over there.
It's funny you guys asked about that because actually a few days before free agency opened, I was getting together my trade targets list, and I had said I actually was calling around about the Dallas Stars and what they were up to, and I was like, they already have one too many goalies because I think Jake Ottinger needs more time in the net. Clearly, Ben Bishop is more than banged up, and so I figured, all along Ben Bishop was a buyout candidate because of all those reasons. Turns out, obviously, they're keeping him, but the thing with the Stars is they don't have any clarity on Ben Bishop's status yet, and apparently they won't have it until September, close to when camp is opening. So I think they wanted some insurance. Maybe they're not convinced about Jake Ottinger, and maybe that's the real takeaway from here is that, maybe they're thinking that Ottinger, who still, I believe, can pass through waivers, doesn't need waivers, is waiver exempt, that maybe Ottinger doesn't start in the NHL and they go with Hudobin and Holtby. I'm not really sure what to make of the whole situation. I definitely was surprised when someone whispered in my ear on Sportsnet on free agency day, Braden Holtby's going to Dallas. And I looked at my sheet. I was like trying to corner the goalie market all day. And I was like, Dallas? Really? And so, yeah, a little bit surprising, but the old saying used to be you can never have too many defensemen. Maybe it's really you can never have too many goalies. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, things have changed a little bit with the 32nd team added here, but yeah.
Well, it's important to keep in mind, guys, though, this is going to be an interesting year for goalies because, again, it's a little bit of a condensed schedule with the NHL likely going to the Olympics. And so if you've got, you're going to need two goalies. Like I think it's an especially critical year for any guy who's likely going to be a starter in the Olympics. Like I'm looking at a Vasilevsky, for instance. You needed to nail down your backup position, and Tampa needed to do it at a real budget price at $900,000, and they had targeted someone that would actually be willing to play for that amount. Brian Elliott ended up being the guy, but they're going to need to rely on Brian Elliott sort of before the Olympic break, after the Olympic break, maybe a little bit more in March as Vasilevsky gets back and gets used to playing after probably carrying Team Russia or whatever the ROC team is going to be called in Beijing, provided that the NHL is going.
Yeah, you have to think that Washington having to start Craig Anderson last year is making teams in the playoffs, is making teams almost think, we got to have that third guy, or Colorado the year before with Hutchinson. You almost have to have that third something there because it seems to be happening at least to one of the 16 that makes it in every year. So,
no doubt.
Yeah.
You brought up Tampa really quickly. They were another team that I kind of had penciled in as a winner, just because, like you said, they were so up against the cap and they needed to do...
Wait. You made Tampa because all they do is win. You made them a winner?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I see how that works.
I just feel like Tampa Bay did some very tidy work in a very, very difficult situation. They seemingly just continue to get themselves out of these tight spots time and again. You bring up Brian Elliott, bringing in a veteran backup who's been solid throughout his NHL career. To help out Vasilevsky. You bring in Pierre-Edouard Bellemare to help with that fourth line. He is just the ideal fourth line center. Corey Perry comes in and at a very cheap cost. They get rid of Tyler Johnson. They bring on Seabrook to LTIR him. It just seems that they do just this tidy work all the time. So they were the other team that we didn't talk about yet that I had as a winner. I just would like to know your thoughts on the Lightning's offseason so far.
Sometimes I think Julian Brisebois, their GM, is playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. Yep. It seems like he's kind of always one step or one move ahead of everyone else. I know teams were actually surprised right after Tampa's Cup win. They were calling around to them saying, "Hey, can we trade for one of your defensemen?" They're like, "No, we're good. We don't need to move anyone. We're all set on our offseason plans." And they're like, "All set? Like you're $10 million over the cap. How does that work?" And so I think by then they had known that Seattle was targeting Yanni Gourde. You could still ask the question, and I think it would be fair, whether Seattle actually squeezed them enough. Like if I was Seattle, and I've said this before, I would have said, "Hey, I'm taking Matthew Joseph off your hands. I think that guy can score 20 or 25 goals easy next year. He had 12 in a shortened season without a lick of any sort of special teams time. Get that guy, have him score 20 or 25. And then if you want to give me someone else for free to help your cap situation, a Yanni Gourde, a Tyler Johnson, whoever it is, Andre Palat, I'll take him off your hands." But in this case, So they lose really an entire grind line, an identity line with Gord, Coleman, and I'm blanking on the other. Barkley Goodrow that goes to New York. They lose those guys, and they lose Tyler Johnson, who goes to Chicago. But I do think that they filled out their group appropriately. So I don't think they're going to be quite as good as they were the last 2 years, and understandable. I mean, you really can't keep that core together, that $98.5 million core together. But I do think that they're still going to be a really good team. Look, the starting base that they have, Vasilevsky, arguably the best goalie in the world, Victor Hedman, arguably the best defenseman in the world. And then you've got Nikita Kucherov up front, arguably the best scorer in the world, although Connor McDavid would argue with that, I think. But, I mean, that's your starting foundation, and then you've got the depth that sort of trickles down from there. I think the Tampa Bay Lightning are going to be just fine.
Yeah, it is hilarious to look at the fact that they lost basically their identity line in total, and then they just have that much depth that they can kind of be like, oh, well, Matthew Joseph's a third-line player now, and you're like, yeah, he would be on any other team in the NHL. They're just absolutely loaded and probably poised for another cup run this year. All right, so we're not going to call them losers, but who maybe didn't do enough this offseason, or who didn't do enough with their assets or their cap space heading into 2022?
All right, so pretty obvious one would be the Buffalo Sabres, and it's really for all the reasons opposite of what the Arizona Coyotes were doing. I did like some portions, I guess, of the trade with Florida for Reinhart. I think Devin Levi is a top goalie prospect. They're a team that needed a goalie in their system. They now have one that they can circle and say, okay, this is the guy that we're grooming and growing for that number one role. And I get that. And the first round pick is fine. So there's no real issue with that trade. It's really just the fact that it's now August. The calendar's flipped to August, and we're still talking about Jack Eichel being a Buffalo Sabre. Like, I get that they weren't going to give him away. I get that, look, the fact that this story is ongoing, though, to me is probably a failure on some level. And the fact that as we get closer and closer to training camp, the price would probably seemingly continue to drop. Now, if the Sabres want to play hardball and hold firm on exactly what they've been asking for, well, then that's fine. But just be prepared for the circus that comes with Jack Eichel showing up to camp. Do you have to take the C off his jersey? All those other things. Does he report? Does he try and push and go ahead with the surgery that he'd like to get? I do think the return on Rasmus Ristolainen was quite good, but still, the fact that we're talking about the Sabres at this point, and sort of all the pieces that they've plucked off their roster, they're in the race for Shane Wright, but I don't think they have nearly the same sort of upside and future that Arizona has.
It's funny when you talk about that same Reinhart trade, because it is a good return for them to get Levi, but from the Florida Panthers perspective, Levi means basically nothing at that point. So it's interesting the way you can look at that trade, because for Florida, it seems like an absolute, home run, somebody to get to come in and play next to Barkov and just light it up. And then, but for the Sabres, I do agree there. Anybody else that didn't do enough for you?
Yeah. Vegas losing Marc-Andre Fleury for nothing. I think the way that was handled was really poor. This guy was an icon, a face of your franchise. For him to find out on Twitter, I think is so wrong on so many levels. And I know that they've tried to backpedal from that, but the fact that they showed Ryan Reeves, that they showed him a little bit more respect and were working through the process with him, picking his landing spot. Of course, he ends up with an extension in short order from New York. If you were following on DailyFaceoff.com, our trade targets, we had mentioned Ryan Reeves in New York for quite some time. He's their solution to their Tom Wilson problem. Hilarious. And he adds some significant toughness and identity to their group. But for Vegas, Marc-Andre Fleury, now you're going with Robin Leonard in net. And I know that he's going to play in tandem there, but geez, he's a 313-pound goalie, and he's got a lot to prove in a difficult schedule year again. Now 82 games instead of a shortened 56, that he can help carry this team. His numbers have been consistently excellent, but he's really played in spot duty because Fleury carried the ball for so long. And so a team that also really needed to bolster itself down the middle. I'm still not quite understanding the Dadonov trade. I know that he can be a productive player, but I don't necessarily see exactly how he fits in, and it's also at a pretty big cap hit. I would think that at some point, one of Marchessault or Smith is still going to be on the move here, and maybe I'm not seeing the entire picture. Maybe they're a team that does make a move for Jack Eichel, but for me, it's hard to look at the Vegas Golden Knights and say that this team that was so close to winning the President's Trophy and had a disappointing playoff exit is better now than they were last year. And then another disappointing team for me is the Toronto Maple Leafs. They've got a lot to do, I think, to get better. The Peter Mrazek decision in net, I think, left people a little bit wondering, because I think what happened was, if I'm looking back on the situation in its totality on the goaltending front, they, I think, had their sights set on either Darcy Kemper, maybe trying to get in the Philip Grubauer situation, Linus Ullmark. And so I think the way that they were viewing the market as it would play out would just be that Grubauer would end up staying in Colorado. Kemper, maybe wasn't worth the asking price that Arizona had set and ultimately ended up receiving, including that first-round pick plus. And then Linus Ullmark, they wanted him, I think, at a pretty specific number, provided that he was leaving the Buffalo Sabres. Of course, he ended up doing that. Grubauer ended up going to Seattle. Kemper went up to Colorado. And then Ullmark, in this case, went to Buffalo. And so I think what they were guarding against was just being left with nothing as the goalie carousel continued to turn. They end up with Mrazek on a somewhat bargain deal, but some pretty significant term at 3 years, $3.8 million. He's sort of like the number 5 or 6 best goalie available on my list, depending on how you're looking at it. And then up front, I do like the signing of Kampf. I think he could be sort of, he could be your Philip Deneau light in the group. I think he's a guy that is so incredibly defensively conscious that makes a lot of sense and on a bargain deal. But Kashe has some significant injury history. Again, a little risk because you can bury the deal if it doesn't work out. Same thing with Michael Bunting. But this is a group that lost in pretty spectacular fashion in the first round and, isn't really significantly better on paper and is basically bringing back the entire same core and group.
Yeah. Your list and my list are basically in lockstep at this point. I think just going back to Vegas really quickly, it is just interesting to me that you give away Marc-Andre Fleury for nothing, his $7 million cap hit, really only to bring in Dadonov and Janmark at the exact same cap hit combined. It's just that doesn't seem like enough for getting to know or giving Fleury away for nothing. You'd seem like maybe they were a team that should have been maybe a little bit heavier after somebody like Philip Deneau, like you said, to help down the middle. Because bringing in Dadonov really doesn't move the needle for a team that, they've had Alex Tuch playing on the third line when he should probably be a top 6 player his entire career. So the last thing they needed was probably another scoring winger for their bottom 6.
Unless they're planning on moving one of those guys to help them get a center. Does like a Marchessault or Riley Smith go to a place like New York in exchange for like a Ryan Strome? Like there must be some other move here coming that I'm not seeing. And until this point, if it's not an incomplete, like they're sort of getting that negative grade for sure.
Yeah, that's why we kind of said at the top of the show, who hasn't done enough to date, because there's got to be something else to give. There's even in Toronto now, going back to the Leafs, like you just mentioned, there still seems to be something up there. Like they just kind of have too many bodies and not enough spots for some of the guys on the roster. Obviously, maybe some players weren't quite as NHL ready as maybe they thought, but the Leafs just seem. I had the Leafs and actually the Bruins as losers, or maybe teams that didn't do enough, just because I felt like the Panthers did so much. Tampa was already kind of so elite, and the Bruins and the Leafs to me did not do quite enough to kind of bridge that gap, close that gap to those guys, or at least to Tampa. And Florida did a nice job. The Leafs, they just really kind of, Bunting, Nick Ritchie, Andre Cash, some decent players, but not really anybody that's going to move the needle too much. Cash, obviously, if he can play, he's been kind of somebody that the analytics people have loved throughout his entire career, but just staying on the ice is one thing that doesn't factor into those charts. And hopefully, for the Leafs' sake, he can stay on the ice. But anybody else that didn't do quite enough for you?
I think the San Jose Sharks are another team that's pretty disappointing in terms of their offseason. Like adding Nick Bonino, fine. I think all successful teams have had a player like Nick Bonino. They buy out Martin Jones. It seems like their goaltending picture is James Reimer and Aiden Hill will be the backup. Like they really needed to solve their goaltending. And I know Reimer's numbers have been solid, but talk about a team that really needed a shakeup. And then you see all this stuff going on off the ice with Evander Kane way before these allegations even came out about, gambling on hockey over the weekend. I had been reporting for weeks that Evander Kane had fallen out of favor with his teammates, and they basically had gone into their exit interviews with GM Doug Wilson, with their coaching staff saying, look, this guy can't come back. We can't play with this guy anymore. So he's still there. The allegations have surfaced. The team was already trending in the wrong direction. They've got 3, some would call them pillars, others would call them anchors on their back end, Carlson, Burns, and Vlasic. Like the fact that all those guys are returning, there doesn't seem to be change. Like they seem to be running it back with the same group that has kind of been for 2 years in a row, like not really heading in the right direction.
Yeah, for sure. And then you got a team, like the LA Kings right next door, who seem to just keep getting better, every single month. Their prospect pool is great. They bring in Danault. I heard you talking about it on the DFO rundown the other day, and it's something that I've been talking about as well, is this going to really unlock Anze Kopitar? The fact, because we've seen Anze Kopitar put up some outstanding numbers throughout his career, but fantasy owners kind of seemingly always want a little bit more from Kopitar. Now that he might not have as many tough matchups, and some of those tougher matchups will go to Danault, is this really going to unlock Anze Kopitar in LA, you think?
I think so. I think that's the whole point, is take some of the stress of the minutes, the defensive responsibilities, the matchup, all that off of his plate, and allow him to get back to being that sort of point per game, close to it type player that's scoring 30 plus goals. And I think Danault can shoulder a little bit of that. I think the one disappointing thing, if you're the Kings, is that it's a pretty significant price to pay in both term and dollars for Danault, for a guy whose offensive output is really still kind of somewhat limited. And I think you have to go back to 2 years ago where you could say, when Danault got to that 53-point mark, even, maybe a little bit more than or less than that, 47 points that he did in 71 games in 2019-20 before the pandemic hit. That's sort of the production that you need to get to in order to justify that cost. And that's, still saying that Phillip Danault is in the Selke conversation in that top 10 forward realm. But I do really like the acquisition that they made in Victor Arvidsson. Pretty inexpensive price. You've got him at a good cap hit for the next 3 years. I think he could get back to that 25, 30 goal range. And, just some other bets that you've made. Alex Iafallo is a really good player on their back end. Matt Roy and Sean Walker, they're both in good spots. They've got some young players that they're assimilating into their lineup. And the big question mark for me is still going to be in net. They believe in Cal Peterson. They left Jonathan Quick exposed. He was extremely fired up to be exposed. I think that was a shock. By all accounts, he is not a very happy camper. He had a better season last year, and I think he's a guy that, to me, has some more to bring to the table, bouncing back a little bit.
Yeah. And Frank, one final question here for you. I'm an Avs fan personally, and one of the biggest shockers this offseason was just seeing Grubauer go to Seattle. You said, Toronto expected, Colorado would lock him up, kind of the pieces would fall in. How do you feel about that trade? And also, as far as Kemper goes, was it a good, viable solution? Kind of what's going on there? Because that was a big, I know I was out on the water and almost had to triple take if I had service that deal even happened, the Seattle one. And yeah. Interesting.
I actually really like the trade for Colorado, and I know that's not a popular view, but I think Kemper, when he's healthy and he can stay on the ice, I think he's one of the 5 best goalies in the league. And so, Grubauer to me had a really good year. I wonder if a better goalie can have a better year. Yeah. And I just think when you were able to get Arizona to retain some money is really what made the deal worthwhile. The big thing for me, I think the Avs back end. If you can have a healthy Eric Johnson, I think that changes sort of the look. And then they got a little bit bigger and nastier with Curtis McDermott at 6'5". I think the Avs are going to be just fine. They've got a little bit of cap space to play with. They've gotten everyone for the most part signed. They got Joe signed over the weekend. I just think they have a little bit of flexibility and wiggle room to maybe make this team even a little bit better. But all the pieces are there to really kind of be good and competitive for the next number of years now, up until they need to pay McKinnon.
Yeah, and I think I think that's kind of the way that I've been feeling about it. A lot of people we're so attached to somebody like Grubauer, after a season like last year. But I do think Kemper out there.
Look at Kemper's numbers and then look at the team he was playing on.
Absolutely, yeah.
You put him now on a really good team, and I think those numbers can be in the 925, 928 realm. Even on top of what Grubauer was able to accomplish last year.
Yeah, if you look at 18-19 combined, 19-20 hit a 926 save percentage in Arizona. I personally think that maybe they wanted to bring Grubauer back, but I think maybe not signing him is going to end up being a good thing for him, because, like you said, Kemper can be an absolute stud on a good
They
team.
just had a budget, Brock. It was we're paying $5 million flat. We can do 5 times 5. Grubauer is looking for a 6 times 6. He thought he should be in sort of that Binnington Markstrom world. And I get it, coming off of a season like that. Look, more power to you. I'm never going to begrudge a player asking for more money, but the Avs are saying,
can do it. Yeah.
This is it's the one time you can do it. I think that's a great point. And I think, for the Avs perspective, they're like, we have an internal budget that we need to stick to, and we need to stick to $5 million. I think you saw Omar come in right around that same number. There were more questions about Omar's health than I think anyone that was available on the premier sort of top end of the goalie market. And I think they end up with a guy in Kemper at a reduced number at 3.5 that just gives them more flexibility elsewhere. And there's also not a lot of term. See how Kemper does. Get to January and then reassess and evaluate your goaltending situation. If you love Kemper, re-sign him to that sort of longer-term deal in that $5 million range, and then you're set budget-wise moving forward. I just think it makes a lot of sense for Colorado, a team that really needs to watch every dollar in and out.
And you know what? The Avalanche seem to be a team that has stuck to their dollars with every single player that they've signed over the recent years. Like even Makar coming in at $9 million seems a little bit lower when you see Jones and Werenski's contracts. Like they seem to always just stick to their dollar, and they seems to work out very well for them. But Frank, we've gone well over our allotted time here, so I appreciate you joining the show. Hopefully we can have you on again soon. For all of our DFO listeners, we will be releasing another episode this upcoming Friday with me, Beebs, and Dylan, breaking down all of the offseason moves from more of a fantasy perspective. But for now, I'm Brock Seguin. We have Beebs Bondy here as well. Thank you again, Frank, for joining us. And again, like I said, hopefully we have you on here soon.
My pleasure, guys. Can't wait to talk to you guys once the season gets rolling.
Absolutely. Awesome. Best of luck in the next month there too.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.